The blood-stained sunset painted the Montana sky crimson, as Yates Forster urged his exhausted horse over the final ridge toward Sweet Creek. 3 days of hard riding had left man and beast alike covered in trail dust, sweat, and the unmistakable dark patches that told a story Yates wasn't eager to share. His normally pristine cotton shirt was torn and stiffened with dried blood, some his own, but mostly belonging to men who wouldn't be riding anywhere ever again. Sweet Creek appeared below him, a collection of wooden structures nestled alongside the glittering ribbon of water that gave the settlement its name. In 1873, it wasn't much a general store, saloon, small church, blacksmith, and a scattering of homesteads spreading out into the surrounding valley. But among those homesteads was the only place Yates had ever truly considered home. He hadn't planned on returning this way. Not with 5 dead men left behind him in the high country, not with a price likely already on his head. But a wounded man with limited options makes desperate choices, and home was the only direction his weary mind could set. The bullet graze along his ribs burned with each breath. The deeper wound in his thigh had stopped bleeding, but the makeshift bandage had done little more than keep him from bleeding out on the trail. He needed proper tending, rest, and time to figure out his next move before word spread about what happened at Broken Skull Pass. As he guided his horse down the slope, Yates caught sight of a slender figure moving among the garden rows at the Baker homestead. Even from a distance, he recognized the graceful movements of Eleanor Baker. Ellie, as she was known to those close to her, though he'd lost the right to such familiarity 3 years ago when he'd ridden away without explanation. The weight of his Winchester rifle against his saddle reminded him of all that had changed. He was no longer the idealistic young ranch hand who'd courted the schoolteacher's daughter with poetry and promises. Now he rode with blood on his hands and secrets that could destroy whatever welcome he might hope to receive, but there was nowhere else to go. Yates steered his mount toward the path that led to the Baker property, knowing he was making a dangerous choice. Old Man Baker had warned him never to return. Ellie had written him exactly 1 letter after he left. The words still burned into his memory. "You've broken something that cannot be mended. Do not come back." Yet here he was, broken himself and hoping against reason that whatever remained between them might be enough to buy him shelter for at least 1 night. Ellie sensed the approach before she heard it, that prickle of awareness that had served frontier women for generations. She straightened from her work in the vegetable garden, brushing soil from her apron as she turned toward the sound of hoofbeats. The evening sun backlit the approaching rider, casting him in silhouette. There was something in the way he sat his horse slightly favoring one side, shoulders set with familiar determination that made her heart stutter before her mind could place him. "Yates," she whispered, the name falling from her lips before conscious thought formed it. 3 years had passed since she'd watched him ride away, taking her heart and plans for the future with him. 3 years of wondering, of anger slowly cooling to resignation, of learning to build a life without him. And now, as if conjured from her most private thoughts, here he was. As he drew closer, the romantic notion fled. This was no triumphant return. His clothes were filthy, torn in places. Dark stains that could only be blood marked his shirt and trousers. His face, half hidden beneath a beard that hadn't been there when he left, was gaunt and weathered beyond the passing years. Ellie's hand moved to her throat, fingers resting on the small gold cross her mother had given her before passing. "Dear Lord," she murmured, "give me strength." For a moment, she considered calling for her father, but he had ridden to town for supplies and wouldn't return until morning. The ranch hands were working the north pasture. She stood alone, facing the ghost of her past who looked more like a hunted outlaw than the man she had once planned to marry. Yates drew his horse to a halt several yards from where she stood. He made no move to dismount, perhaps uncertain of his welcome. "Miss Baker," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. The formality stung. "So it's Miss Baker now." She shook her head, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What brings you back to Sweet Creek, Mr. Forster? Last I heard, you were making your fortune in the silver mines." Pain flashed across his face, whether from her words or his wounds. She couldn't tell. "I need help, Ellie." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I wouldn't come if there was anywhere else." Only then did she notice how he clutched at his side, the unnatural paleness beneath the trail dirt. Whatever had happened to him, whatever he had done, he was hurt. "You're injured," she stated flatly. "Yes." "And those stains, is that your blood?" His eyes, those same deep green eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness, now darkened. "Not all of it." The implications hung between them. She should turn him away. By all rights and sense, she should tell him to ride on, to find help elsewhere. The man before her was trouble, dangerous trouble if the blood on his clothes told the story she suspected, but something in her couldn't do it. Maybe it was the memory of what they had once shared, or perhaps simply the Christian charity her mother had instilled in her. Whatever the reason, Ellie found herself gesturing toward the barn. "Get your horse out of sight. I'll meet you at the back door." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she cautioned. "I haven't decided whether I'll help you or fetch the sheriff after I hear what you've done." Inside the house, Ellie moved with quick efficiency, heating water on the stove and gathering clean cloths, her mother's sewing kit, and the whiskey her father kept for medicinal purposes. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. 3 years of carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble at the mere proximity of Yates Forster. She heard the soft knock at the back door and took a steadying breath before opening it. Yates stood on the threshold, looking even worse up close. A sheen of sweat covered his forehead and he leaned heavily against the doorframe. "Come in," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. He limped into the kitchen, the familiar space seeming to shrink with his presence. Ellie gestured to a chair. "Sit before you fall." He obeyed without argument, easing himself down with a poorly suppressed groan. She noted how his right hand never strayed far from the holster at his hip, a habit he hadn't possessed when he left. "I need to see your wounds," she said. Professional detachment, her only defense against the storm of emotions his presence evoked. Yates nodded, fingers working at the buttons of his ruined shirt. When he struggled with them, Ellie stepped forward, brushing his hands aside to complete the task herself. She tried to ignore the heat of his skin beneath her fingers, the familiar contours now marked with new scars. "What happened?" she asked as she helped him remove the shirt, revealing a makeshift bandage wrapped around his ribs. "Got into some trouble north of here." His voice was tight with pain. 5 men. Ambush." Ellie's hands stilled. "You killed them." His eyes met hers, unflinching. "They were Harlow's men." "They didn't leave me much choice." The name sent ice through her veins. Victor Harlow, the cattle baron whose empire stretched across 3 territories. A man known for using hired guns to expand his holdings by whatever means necessary. "What did you do to earn Harlow's attention?" She began unwrapping the crude bandage, revealing an angry red furrow across his ribs where a bullet had grazed him. Yates winced as she cleaned the wound. "I was working security for the railroad." "Harlow doesn't want the line coming through the northern valley, cuts too close to land he wants for himself." "So you're not an outlaw." The relief in her voice was unmistakable. A ghost of his old smile touched his lips. "Not technically. But I doubt that distinction matters to the men Harlow will send next." Ellie processed this as she worked, cleaning the wound with careful, practiced movements. Her mother had been the closest thing Sweet Creek had to a doctor before her passing 2 years ago, and Ellie had learned much at her side. "There's another wound," Yates admitted, gesturing to his thigh. Ellie nodded, her professional demeanor faltering only slightly at the implication. "You'll need to remove your trousers." A flush crept up her neck as Yates stood awkwardly, unfastening his belt. She turned to busy herself with the bandages, giving him a moment of privacy. When she turned back, he sat in just his undergarments, the blood-soaked bandage visible on his upper thigh. This wound was worse, a deep gouge that had narrowly missed the major blood vessels. Cleaning and stitching it would be painful for them both. "Drink this," she said, pouring a generous measure of whiskey. "You'll need it." Yates took the glass, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The simple contact sparked memories she'd fought to suppress, his hand holding hers as they walked along the creek. His fingers entwined with hers beneath the harvest moon, the gentle pressure of his palm against the small of her back as they danced at the town social. He downed the whiskey in one swallow, grimacing at the burn. "Your father still keeps the good stuff, I see. He says life's too short for bad whiskey." Ellie dampened a cloth. "This will hurt." Yates nodded, bracing himself. When she pressed the cloth against the wound, he hissed between clenched teeth but made no other sound. "Why did you leave?" The question escaped before she could stop it, forced out by the intimacy of tending his wounds, his eyes, clouded with pain, focused on her face. "Ellie." "I deserve an answer, Yates. 3 years without a word. You owe me that much." His jaw tightened. "Your father came to me the night before I left, said he'd never consent to our marriage, that you deserved better than a ranch hand with nothing to his name." Shock froze her hands momentarily. "And you believed him. You thought so little of my feelings that you left without even speaking to me." "He threatened to disown you," Yates continued, voice rough. "Said you'd lose everything, the ranch, your position at the school, your standing in town. I couldn't be the reason you lost everything you loved. So you decided for me." Anger flared, hot and fresh. "You made that choice for both of us. I thought I was protecting you." His hand caught hers, stilling her movements. "I thought I could make my fortune and return worthy of you." Ellie pulled her hand away, resuming her work with deliberate focus. "And now you return wounded, hunted, with blood on your hands." Bitterness edged her words. "Was it worth it, Yates? Did you find what you were looking for?" He was silent for a long moment. "No," he finally admitted. "I found that the thing I valued most was what I left behind." The simple honesty in his voice threatened to unravel her carefully constructed defenses. Ellie threaded a needle, focusing on the task rather than the implication of his words. "This needs stitching," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Hold still." As she worked, the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken words. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the kitchen in golden twilight. Ellie lit the oil lamp, the warm glow illuminating Yates's face as she completed the final stitches. "There," she said, cutting the thread. "It's not my mother's work, but it should hold. Thank you." Yates studied her face in the lamplight. "You've changed, Ellie." She met his gaze steadily. 3 years will do that." "Your eyes haven't changed," he observed softly. "Still see right through a man." Ellie wrapped a clean bandage around his thigh, securing it carefully. "You should rest. The spare room is made up. In the morning we can decide what to do." Yates caught her wrist gently as she rose. "I shouldn't stay. If Harlow's men track me here, it's nearly dark, and you're in no condition to ride," she interrupted. "Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight you need rest." The familiar stubbornness in her tone brought a faint smile to his lips. "Yes, madam." Ellie helped him to the spare room, acutely aware of his arm around her shoulders. his weight leaning into her side. The scent of him trailed dust and leather mixed with the copper tang of blood-stirred memories that made her heart ache. At the doorway to the room, he paused. "I never stopped thinking about you, Ellie, not for a single day." She stepped away, creating distance between them. "Rest, Yates. We'll talk in the morning." Alone in the kitchen, Ellie sank into a chair, her composure finally crumbling. Tears she'd refused to shed in his presence now flowed freely. 3 years of building a life without him, of convincing herself she had moved beyond the pain of his abandonment, and now he was under her roof again, wounded and vulnerable. And despite everything, despite the anger and hurt, she couldn't deny that something inside her had awakened at the sight of him, some piece of herself that had been dormant since he rode away. As night settled over Sweet Creek, Ellie wiped away her tears and began cleaning up the evidence of her nursing. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with the strength she had forged in his absence. Whether that meant helping him escape or watching him ride away again, she would endure. But as she worked, a whispered prayer escaped her lips. "Lord, give me the wisdom to know what is right and the courage to do it." Dawn broke over Sweet Creek with the promise of another scorching summer day. Ellie had slept little, her mind circling between concern for Yates's wounds, anxiety about her father's impending return, and the turmoil of her own conflicted feelings. She rose early, dressing in a simple blue cotton dress before quietly checking on her patient. Yates slept deeply, his breathing steady, if slightly labored. The fever she had feared might take hold after such wounds seemed absent, a small mercy she attributed to prompt cleaning of the injuries. In the kitchen, she stoked the stove and began preparing breakfast, the familiar tasks grounding her in normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances. Coffee percolated, filling the house with its rich aroma, and biscuits began to brown in the oven while bacon sizzled in the cast iron skillet. "Something smells like heaven." Ellie turned to find Yates standing in the doorway, dressed in the clean clothes she had left for him, her father's spare shirt and trousers, slightly loose on his leaner frame. "You shouldn't be up," she chided, but without real force behind it. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," he admitted with a wry smile, "but considerably better than yesterday." He limped to the table, easing himself into a chair with a poorly concealed wince. Ellie poured him coffee, setting it before him without meeting his eyes. "My father will return from town this morning," she said, turning back to the stove. "He should be here within the hour." Yates's fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "I should be gone before he arrives. In your condition, you'd be lucky to make it 5 miles. Ellie placed a plate of food before him. "Besides, running will only confirm any suspicions." "Your father made his feelings about me quite clear," Yates reminded her, though he began eating with the appetite of a man who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Ellie sat across from him, cradling her own coffee. "That was 3 years ago. Things change." "Have they?" His green eyes studied her face. "Have your father's feelings about me changed?" She couldn't lie to him. "No, but his opinion isn't the only one that matters." A loaded silence fell between them. Yates ate methodically, clearly savoring the home-cooked meal despite their tense conversation. Ellie watched him, noting the new lines around his eyes, the hardness that hadn't been there before. He had changed, become something more weathered and wary, but underneath she could still see traces of the young man who had once quoted Tennyson to her beneath the cottonwood tree. "Tell me what happened," she finally said. "The full story, Yates. No more half-truths." He set down his fork, weighing his words carefully. "After I left Sweet Creek, I tried my hand at silver mining, like you said. Made some money, lost it all when the claim dried up. Drifted for a while, took whatever work came along." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Ellie sensed the hardship behind the simple narrative. 8 months ago, I signed on with the Northern Pacific as security. The railroad's pushing west, and not everyone welcomes progress. Victor Harlow least of all. Harlow has half the territory in his pocket, Ellie noted. What makes the railroad different? Can't bribe a corporation the way you can local officials, Yates explained. The railroad follows its own interests, and those interests include cutting through the Northern Valley land Harlow wants for his cattle empire. He sipped his coffee before continuing. 2 weeks ago, someone sabotaged a survey crew's equipment. 3 days later, the lead surveyor was found dead accident while cleaning his gun. His expression darkened. I was assigned to escort the replacement surveyor to complete the work. We were ambushed at Broken Skull Pass. By Harlow's men, Ellie supplied. Yates nodded. 5 of them. They killed the surveyor before I could stop them. I managed to take cover, but they had me pinned down. His voice became distant, recounting facts rather than reliving the horror. It was them or me. I made sure it was them. Ellie's hands tightened around her cup. And the railroad. Do they know what happened? I sent a wire from the last town I passed through, but Harlow has friends everywhere. By now, there's probably a story circulating that I killed the surveyor myself and ambushed innocent travelers. His jaw tightened. It's my word against a dead man's, and Harlow has money to make his version the truth. That's why you came back to Sweet Creek, she realized. You need witnesses who know your character. A humorless smile touched his lips. I came back because I was wounded and had nowhere else to go. Sweet Creek was the closest thing to home I had. His eyes met hers. I never expected you to help me, Ellie. Not after what I did. The raw honesty in his voice cut through her defenses. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them. Ellie rose quickly, moving to the window. It's father, she confirmed, watching the familiar figure dismounting from his horse. Stay here. She moved to the front door, stepping onto the porch as Harold Baker secured his mount. Her father, now 63 but still robust from a lifetime of ranching, spotted her and raised a hand in greeting. Morning, daughter. You're up early. Ellie forced a smile. We have a visitor, father. Harold's bushy eyebrows rose. At this hour, he arrived last evening. He was injured and needed help. Suspicion immediately darkened her father's weathered features. Who is it, Eleanor? She drew a steadying breath. Yates Forster. The change was immediate. Her father's face hardened, his posture stiffening. That man is not welcome in my home. He was wounded, father. I couldn't turn him away. You should have sent him to town to the doctor there. And have the whole town talking by sundown. He's in trouble, serious trouble. Harold's eyes narrowed. What kind of trouble? The kind that follows a man who crossed Victor Harlow, came Yates's voice from behind her. Ellie turned to find him standing in the doorway, leaning slightly on the frame for support. He'd managed to straighten his posture, facing her father with quiet dignity despite his injuries. Mr. Baker, he acknowledged with a respectful nod. Harold's hand drifted toward the rifle still secured to his saddle. Forster, I thought I made myself clear 3 years ago. You did, sir. Yates remained calm. I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice. Harlow's men. Harold's tone sharpened. You brought that trouble to my door, to my daughter. I killed 5 of his hired guns in self-defense, Yates stated plainly. They murdered a railroad surveyor I was escorting. Harlow will want revenge, and he has the money and influence to make murder look like justice. Harold's gaze shifted between Yates and his daughter, clearly weighing the situation. Finally, he addressed Ellie. Get inside, Eleanor. Mr. Forster and I need to talk. Father, inside. His tone brooked no argument. Reluctantly, Ellie stepped past Yates into the house. though she remained near enough to the door to hear their conversation. "You have 1 minute to convince me not to ride for the sheriff," her father said coldly. "I won't waste your time with pleas, Mr. Baker," Yates replied. "I'm not asking for sanctuary, just enough time to heal and move on. 1 night, maybe 2, then I'll be gone and you'll never have to see me again. Like last time." Harold's voice dripped with disdain. "You nearly destroyed my daughter when you left." "I left because you gave me no choice," Yates countered, a hint of steel entering his tone. "You threatened to disown her if I stayed. I was protecting her from a man with nothing to offer but pretty words and empty promises. And I respected your wishes," Yates said quietly. "I left as you demanded. I tried to make something of myself. Maybe I failed at that, but I never stopped caring for Ellie." A heavy silence followed. When Harold spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "You ride for the railroad now." "Yes, sir. Security detail. Decent work." The admission seemed reluctant. "Harlow's not a man to cross lightly. If what you say is true, you've got a fight ahead of you." "I know. That's why I won't stay long. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Harold sighed, the sound carrying the weight of years. "You already did that the day you met my daughter." Ellie couldn't bear to remain silent any longer. She pushed the door open, stepping back onto the porch. "I'm not a child, Father. I can make my own decisions about who stays under our roof." Both men turned to look at her, Yates with a mixture of admiration and concern, her father with exasperation. "This isn't about hospitality, Eleanor," Harold said firmly. "This is about safety. Harlow's reach is long and his memory longer. If he learns Forster is here, then we'll face that when it comes," she interrupted. "Together, as a family should." Her father's expression softened slightly at her determination. "You've got your mother's stubbornness, that's certain." He looked back at Yates, measuring him with a critical eye. 2 days. You heal up, then you're gone, and you sleep in the barn, not under my roof. It wasn't acceptance, but it was something." Yates nodded. "Thank you, sir." Harold turned away, leading his horse toward the barn. "I'll be checking my rifle, just in case Harlow's remaining men are better at tracking than your shooting suggests." As her father disappeared into the barn, Ellie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Yates turned to her, his expression troubled. "I shouldn't have come. I'm putting you both in danger." "Where else would you have gone?" she asked softly. He had no answer for that. "Come inside," Ellie said. "You should rest that leg." As they returned to the kitchen, the weight of their situation settled fully upon her shoulders. They had 2 days to heal Yates's wounds, to decide what came next, and perhaps to address the unresolved feelings that still lingered between them like morning mist over the creek. 2 days before he would ride away again, this time perhaps forever. The day passed in uneasy peace. Harold Baker kept his distance, busying himself with ranch work while periodically scanning the horizon for approaching riders. Ellie tended to her usual chores, returning frequently to check on Yates's wounds and change his bandages. By late afternoon, Yates had grown restless with confinement. Despite Ellie's protests, he insisted on sitting on the back porch, where the fresh air and view of the surrounding countryside seemed to ease his tension. "The wound needs rest," she reminded him as she brought him a glass of water. "So does my mind," he replied, eyes scanning the tree line with practiced vigilance. "Being trapped inside makes me feel like a cornered animal." Ellie settled beside him on the porch step, her skirts arranged carefully around her. The familiar scent of summer surrounded them, sun-baked earth, ripening garden vegetables, and the distant sweetness of wildflowers from the meadow beyond the creek. "You remember the day we went fishing at Cripple Creek?" Yates asked suddenly, his gaze still focused on the distant landscape. The memory surfaced immediately, a sun-dappled afternoon 3 summers past. their laughter echoing across the water as Yates demonstrated his supposedly foolproof fishing technique, only to lose his footing on a slippery rock and tumble headlong into the creek. "You claimed you meant to do it," Ellie recalled, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "Said it was an ancient Indian method of catching fish by surprise. And you believed me for all of 10 seconds, he chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I wanted to believe you," she admitted. "I wanted to believe everything you told me back then." The lightness of the moment evaporated. Yates turned to look at her directly, his expression solemn. "I never lied to you, Ellie, about how I felt, about what I wanted for us. Just about why you left." The words held no accusation, only a quiet sadness. "I thought I was protecting you, by making decisions for me." Ellie shook her head. "That wasn't protection, Yates, that was pride." He considered this, fingers absently tracing the bandage visible beneath his borrowed shirt. "Maybe you're right. I convinced myself I was being noble, riding away to seek my fortune, but maybe I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of failing you," he admitted, the words seemingly pulled from some deep, carefully guarded place. "Of watching the light in your eyes dim as you realized I couldn't give you the life you deserved." Ellie's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Did you ever think that perhaps I should have been allowed to decide what life I deserved?" Before he could answer, a distant movement caught his attention. Yates tensed, rising to his feet despite the pain it clearly caused him. "Someone's coming," he said, voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. "Riders, 3 of them." Ellie stood quickly, following his gaze to where 3 mounted figures approached along the main road. They were too distant to identify, but their purposeful pace suggested they weren't merely passing by. "Get inside," Yates instructed, reaching instinctively for a sidearm that wasn't there. His weapons had been stored in the barn at Harold Baker's insistence. "Wait." Ellie placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let me see who it is before we assume the worst." She stepped off the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. As the riders drew closer, recognition dawned. "It's Sheriff Wilson," she said with palpable relief. "And Dr. Abernathy. The third looks like, yes, it's Mr. Jenkins from the telegraph office." Yates's posture remained tense. "That's not necessarily good news." Harold emerged from the barn, rifle in hand as he approached the house. "We've got company," he called to them. "Get inside, both of you." "It's the sheriff, Father," Ellie explained, "and the doctor, all the more reason." Harold's expression was grim. "Forster, get out of sight." But it was too late. The riders had spotted them and quickened their pace. Within minutes they drew their horses to a halt in the yard, dust settling around them in the golden afternoon light. Sheriff Thomas Wilson, a barrel-chested man with a neatly trimmed silver beard, dismounted first. Though past 60, he moved with the confidence of a man half his age, his weathered face set in official solemnity. "Afternoon, Harold," he greeted, then nodded to Ellie. "Miss Baker." His eyes settled on Yates, narrowing slightly. "Forster, I might have guessed I'd find you here." Yates straightened, facing the lawman with quiet dignity despite his obvious weakness. "Sheriff." Wilson studied him for a long moment. "Got some questions for you about what happened up at Broken Skull Pass." "I figured as much," Yates replied evenly, "though I'm surprised word traveled so fast." Jenkins, the telegraph operator, cleared his throat. "Wire came through this morning, from the Northern Pacific office in Helena." He produced a yellow telegram from his vest pocket. "They're looking for you, Forster, quite urgently." Dr. Abernathy, a thin man with spectacles perched on his prominent nose, interjected, "I came along in case you needed medical attention. Word was you'd been injured in the incident." Ellie stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between Yates and the sheriff. "He was wounded. I've been treating him. And harboring a wanted man, Sheriff Wilson added, though his tone lacked the harshness the words implied. Wanted? Harold's grip tightened on his rifle. You didn't mention that part, Forster. Is that what the telegram says? Yates asked Jenkins directly, ignoring Harold's accusation. The telegraph operator adjusted his spectacles. Not exactly. It says you're to be. How did they phrase it? Located and provided all necessary assistance. They want you in Helena to give testimony. Relief visibly washed over Yates. Then the surveyor's notes made it through. Sheriff Wilson nodded slowly. Found on one of the dead men, according to the wire, along with a letter implicating Harlow in the previous surveyor's death. His expression remained professionally neutral. Convenient evidence. Not convenient, Yates corrected. Intentional. The surveyor suspected he might be targeted. He entrusted copies of his work to me just before the ambush. Wilson exchanged glances with Dr. Abernathy. That matches what came through on the wire. The railroad's backing your version of events, Forster. For now, Ellie questioned. Harlow has influence, the sheriff explained. And 5 dead men create a lot of questions, regardless of circumstances. He turned back to Yates. You're not under arrest, but I am instructed to escort you to Helena once you're fit to travel. Dr. Abernathy stepped forward. Perhaps I should examine those wounds, determine when travel might be possible. Harold Baker, who had been listening with increasing tension, finally spoke. This is all well and good, but what about my family? If Harlow's as dangerous as you all suggest, are we at risk for having sheltered Forster? It was a valid question that hung heavily in the air. Sheriff Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. Harlow's a businessman above all else, he said finally. With the evidence now in the railroad's possession, he's more likely to distance himself from this mess than pursue personal vendettas. You can't guarantee that, Yates pointed out. No, Wilson conceded. I can't. But I can leave Deputy Morris here for a few days, just as a precaution. Harold nodded, seemingly satisfied with this compromise. I'd appreciate that, Thomas. As the men continued discussing security arrangements, Ellie found herself watching Yates. Relief had softened the hard lines of his face, but something else shadowed his expression: regret, perhaps, or resignation. The realization that his brief return to Sweet Creek was already drawing to a close. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that moment of silent communion, Ellie understood that, despite everything, the blood on his hands, the years of separation, the uncertain future, her feelings for Yates Forster remained unchanged. Buried, perhaps, beneath layers of hurt and pride, but fundamentally unaltered. The knowledge terrified her. Night fell over the Baker homestead, bringing with it a semblance of normalcy that belied the day's revelations. Dr. Abernathy had examined Yates's wounds, pronouncing Ellie's nursing skill remarkably competent, before readdressing the injuries and prescribing at least 3 days of rest before attempting the journey to Helena. Sheriff Wilson had departed after dinner, leaving Deputy Morris, a young man barely into his 20s, with an earnest face and nervous trigger finger, to stand watch from the barn loft. Harold Baker maintained a stony silence throughout the evening meal, his displeasure at hosting not only Yates, but now a deputy as well, evident in every curt response and averted gaze. Ellie moved about the kitchen, clearing away the remains of dinner while her father and Deputy Morris discussed watch rotations on the front porch. Dr. Abernathy had returned to town, promising to check on Yates again the following day. Yates himself sat at the kitchen table, having been grudgingly permitted to remain in the house rather than the barn due to the doctor's insistence that his wounds required proper shelter. He watched Ellie work, his presence both familiar and strange, like a dream remembered upon waking, not quite real yet impossible to dismiss. "Your father still makes the best venison stew in the territory," he observed, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Ellie smiled despite herself. Mother's recipe, he won't change a thing about it, not even after all these years. Some things shouldn't change. Yates's voice softened. Some things are perfect just as they are. The double meaning wasn't lost on her. Ellie set down the plates she was carrying, turning to face him directly. "What will you do after Helena?" she asked. "After your testimony," Yates considered the question, his fingers absently tracing a knot in the wooden tabletop. "I don't know. The railroad will likely offer me another position. Might be wise to take it, move further west. Further from Harlow," she noted, "further from everything." His eyes met hers, holding a question he didn't voice. Ellie looked away first, resuming her task with deliberate focus. 3 years is a long time, Yates. People change. Dreams change. "And feelings?" he asked quietly. "Do they change too?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Ellie set down a cup with more force than intended, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. "You don't have the right to ask me that," she said, surprising herself with the sudden edge in her voice. "Not after you rode away without a backward glance." "I looked back," he corrected softly. "I looked back every day for 3 years." Something inside Ellie broke at his words, some carefully constructed barrier she had built to protect herself from precisely this moment, this conversation. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, turning to face him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You'll be gone again in 3 days. Nothing has changed. My father still disapproves. You still have nothing to offer but uncertainty and danger, and her voice caught. "And you," Yates prompted gently. Ellie drew a shaky breath. "And I still can't bear the thought of watching you ride away again." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Yates rose from his chair, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg, and moved toward her. He stopped just short of touching her, respecting the invisible boundary she had maintained since his return. "Then come with me," he said simply. The words stole her breath. "What?" "Come with me to Helena. After the testimony, we could start fresh somewhere, California maybe, or up in Oregon Territory." His eyes held hers, earnest and unwavering. "I'm not the same man who left 3 years ago, Ellie. I've learned what matters. What I can't live without." The proposition was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had prepared herself for, that Ellie could only stare at him in stunned silence. "You can't be serious," she finally managed. "Leave Sweet Creek, leave my father, everything I know." "For everything we could build together," Yates countered. "I know it's asking a lot, maybe too much, but I had to say it before." The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch interrupted him. Harold Baker entered the kitchen, his expression darkening as he took in their proximity. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, the question directed at his daughter rather than Yates. "Yes, father," Ellie answered, stepping back from Yates with forced composure. "We were just talking." Harold's skeptical gaze shifted between them. "It's getting late. Eleanor, you should retire." "Mr. Forster, the doctor said you need rest." The moment shattered, leaving Ellie with a tangle of emotions she had no time to sort through. She nodded obediently, though a spark of rebellion flared within her at being dismissed like a child. "Good night, father," she said, then added with deliberate emphasis, "Good night, Yates." As she left the kitchen, Ellie felt the weight of both men's gazes following her. She climbed the stairs to her room, mind whirling with Yates's unexpected proposition. "Come with me." The words echoed in her thoughts, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. Could she do it? Could she leave behind everything familiar, her home, her father, the community she had known all her life to follow Yates into an uncertain future. The same man who had abandoned her once before. Yet as she prepared for bed, Ellie found herself considering the possibility with increasing seriousness. Her life in Sweet Creek was comfortable and predictable, but also confined. She taught at the small schoolhouse, maintained her father's home, and attended church socials where well-meaning neighbors introduced her to eligible bachelors she couldn't bring herself to care about. In the 3 years since Yates left, she had built a life, but was it truly living or merely existing? Ellie stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the star-filled Montana sky. Somewhere in the darkness, Deputy Morris kept watch for potential threats. In the room below hers, Yates rested with wounds that spoke of violence and danger, yet also of courage and principle. He had ridden home with blood on his hands, seeking sanctuary and perhaps forgiveness. What he offered now was something else entirely, a future, uncertain though it might be, built on the foundation of feelings that had somehow survived 3 years of separation. As Ellie finally lay down to sleep, one thought crystallized with unexpected clarity. Whatever decision she made in the coming days would define the course of her life. And for perhaps the first time, that decision would be entirely her own. Morning broke clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the grass and birdsong filling the air. Ellie woke early after a restless night, dressing quickly in a simple work dress before making her way downstairs. The house was quiet, her father likely already out checking on the livestock. In the kitchen, she was surprised to find Yates awake and attempting to make coffee, moving with careful deliberation to accommodate his injuries. "You should be resting," she admonished, though without real reproach. He glanced up, a smile warming his features at the sight of her. "Couldn't sleep past dawn, old habits." "At least sit down," Ellie urged, taking over the coffee preparation. "How do your wounds feel this morning?" "Better," he admitted, easing himself into a chair. "Your stitching holds up well." Ellie busied herself with breakfast preparations, aware of his gaze following her movements. The weight of last night's conversation hung between them, unresolved but impossible to ignore. "About what I said last night," Yates began carefully. "It was an impulse," Ellie interrupted, keeping her back to him as she worked. "Heat of the moment. You don't need to, it wasn't." His quiet certainty stopped her. "I've thought about it every mile of the journey here. Every day for 3 years, if I'm being honest." Ellie turned slowly to face him, wooden spoon still in hand. "Yates, I'm not asking for an answer now," he continued. "Just for you to consider it, really consider it." Before she could respond, the door opened and Harold Baker entered, followed by Deputy Morris. Both men looked grim, halting the conversation immediately. "Riders approaching from the north," Harold announced without preamble. 6 of them, moving fast. Yates stood immediately, instinct overriding his physical limitations. "Harlow's men." "Can't tell," Deputy Morris answered, his young face tense with excitement and apprehension. "But they're armed, and they ain't stopping to water their horses." Harold turned to his daughter. "Eleanor, get your rifle and go to the root cellar. There's a firing position from the vent window." "Father, now, Eleanor." His tone brooked no argument. Ellie hesitated only briefly before nodding. As much as she resented being sent away, she understood the tactical advantage of having someone positioned where approaching riders wouldn't expect resistance. "What about you?" she asked Yates. He had already moved to the window, scanning the distant dust cloud that marked the approaching riders. "I'll be where I'm needed." The simple statement carried the weight of a promise, not just for this moment, but perhaps beyond. Ellie held his gaze for a heartbeat, longer than necessary, before hurrying to retrieve her rifle from the gun cabinet. Within minutes, The Baker homestead had transformed from peaceful morning routine to armed defensive position. Harold and Deputy Morris took cover on the front porch, rifles ready. Yates, despite his injuries, positioned himself at the side window with Harold's spare shotgun, while Ellie made her way to the root cellar at the back of the house, where a small ventilation window provided both concealment and a clear view of the approaching trail. The riders appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky, 6 men riding hard, dust billowing behind them. As they drew closer, details became clear: weathered clothes, well-used weapons, faces set with purpose. At their lead rode a tall figure on a distinctive black stallion. "That's Lucas Ryder," Deputy Morris called out, recognition in his voice. "Harlow's head enforcer." "Hold your fire unless they shoot first," Harold instructed. "This is still my property and I won't start a war on it." The riders slowed as they approached the house, spreading out in a semicircle that bespoke military experience. The leader rider raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just beyond easy rifle range. "Harold Baker," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We've come for Forster. Hand him over peaceful-like and we'll be on our way." Harold stood his ground on the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. "This is private property, Ryder. You and your men need to turn around. We know he's here, Baker," Ryder shouted back. "Harlow wants words with him about what happened to our boys up at Broken Skull." From his position at the window, Yates called out, "Your boys murdered an unarmed surveyor. They got what was coming to them." Ryder's attention shifted to the window. "There you are, Forster. Come on out and face what's coming to you like a man." "He's staying right where he is," Harold responded. "The law is already involved. Sheriff Wilson knows everything. Whatever business you think you have with Forster, it's too late." This information gave Ryder pause. He conferred briefly with the men beside him before addressing the house again. "Harlow will pay good money for Forster. $500, cash in hand. More than he's worth to you, Baker." From her position in the root cellar, Ellie watched the standoff with growing dread. These men hadn't come for justice, or even revenge. They had come to silence Yates before he could testify. The realization crystallized her fear into cold determination. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, sighting carefully on Ryder's position. Back on the porch, Harold's posture had stiffened at the offer. "I'm not a man you can bribe, Ryder. Now get off my land before this gets ugly." "It's already ugly, old man," one of Ryder's companions called out. "You're harboring a murderer." "The only murderers I see are on horseback in my front yard," Harold retorted. "Deputy Morris is here representing the law, and you're all about 10 seconds from being arrested." The young deputy stepped forward, badge glinting in the morning sun. "You men are interfering with an official investigation. I'm ordering you to disperse immediately." A tense silence followed, broken only by the snorting of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ryder's hand hovered near his holstered revolver, while his men exchanged uneasy glances. They had clearly expected an easier confrontation, not a defended position with the law present. "Last chance, Baker," Ryder called, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "Harlow won't forget this." "Neither will I," Harold responded firmly. "Now ride out." For a moment, it seemed Ryder might order an attack despite the odds. Ellie steadied her breathing, finger light on the trigger as she kept the man in her sights. Then, with visible reluctance, Ryder raised his hand. "This ain't over, Forster," he shouted toward the house. "Harlow has a long memory." With that final threat, he wheeled his horse around. His men followed suit, and within moments the group was galloping away, dust rising behind them as they retreated toward the northern trail. Harold maintained his vigilant position until the riders disappeared from view, then slowly lowered his rifle. "Morris, ride to town and inform the sheriff what happened. Tell him we need more men out here." The young deputy nodded, rushing to his horse tethered behind the barn. Inside the house, Yates leaned against the wall, face pale with the strain of standing watch despite his injuries. When Ellie returned from the root cellar, their eyes met in silent communication. Relief mingled with the knowledge that the danger had merely receded, not disappeared. Harold entered, his weathered face set in grim lines. "They'll be back," he stated flatly. "Maybe not today, but soon, and with more men." "I should leave," Yates said immediately. "Head for Helena now, draw them away from your property." "In your condition," Ellie protested. "You wouldn't make it halfway." Harold studied Yates thoughtfully, as if seeing him with new eyes. "You were ready to defend my home," he observed, "despite your wounds." "It was the right thing to do," Yates replied simply. A moment of understanding passed between the two men, not forgiveness or acceptance precisely, but a mutual recognition of shared principles. "Ryder offered you money," Yates noted. Harold's expression hardened. "I'm not for sale." Few men would have turned down $500. Few men value their integrity above convenience. Harold set his rifle aside. "Don't mistake this for approval, Forster. I still think you're trouble for my daughter, but I won't hand any man over to the likes of Harlow's gang." It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment Yates would receive from Eleanor Baker's father. He acknowledged it with a respectful nod. Ellie looked between the two most important men in her life, sensing a subtle shift in their dynamic, not friendship, but perhaps the beginning of respect. She thought of Yates's proposition the night before, of the future he had offered beyond Sweet Creek. The morning's confrontation had made one thing abundantly clear. Staying would bring danger not just to her, but to her father as well. As if reading her thoughts, Yates spoke again. "Once I'm gone, they'll have no reason to trouble you or your father. Unless they decide to make an example of anyone who helped you," Ellie pointed out. Harold shook his head. "Harlow's not fool enough to start a war with the whole community. If he can't get to Forster quietly, he'll back down." Too many eyes watching now. Yates didn't appear convinced, but he nodded in agreement, likely for Ellie's benefit. "The doctor said 3 days before I should travel. If the sheriff sends more men, that should be enough protection until then." Harold considered this, then made a decision that surprised them both. "We're not waiting 3 days. As soon as Morris returns with the sheriff, we're moving you to town. The hotel there has better security and more men to defend it if needed." "And Ellie?" Yates asked, concern evident in his voice. "My daughter stays here where she belongs." Harold's tone made clear this point was not negotiable. Ellie wanted to protest, but held her tongue, knowing this wasn't the moment to challenge her father's authority. Instead, she began preparing for the day ahead, her mind working through implications and possibilities as she moved about the kitchen. The die had been cast. In less than a day, Yates would be gone again, first to town, then to Helena for his testimony. Whatever decision she made about her own future needed to come quickly, before circumstances removed the choice entirely. As she worked, Ellie found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Yates. He sat at the table, discussing defensive arrangements with her father, his face drawn with pain but his eyes alert and determined. This was not the same young man who had courted her with poetry and promises 3 years ago. This Yates Forster had been forged in harder fires, a man who had faced death and carried the weight of taking lives, yet remained anchored to principles worth defending. In that moment, watching him across the sunlit kitchen, Ellie realized that she had changed as well. No longer the sheltered girl content to let others determine her path. She had grown into a woman capable of making her own choices and living with their consequences. The realization brought with it a clarity that had eluded her since Yates's unexpected return. By midday, she knew exactly what she would do. Sheriff Wilson arrived with 4 deputies shortly before noon, grim-faced and prepared for trouble. Deputy Morris had evidently conveyed the seriousness of the situation, as the lawman came well-armed and riding hard. Ryder and his boys passed through town heading north, Wilson informed them as they gathered in the baker's front yard. Stopped at the saloon long enough to ask some questions about stage schedules to Helena. They're planning to intercept us on the road, Yates concluded, leaning heavily on a walking stick Dr. Abernathy had provided during his morning visit. Wilson nodded. Likely, which is why we're changing plans. The regular stage leaves tomorrow, but there's a private coach coming through this afternoon railroad business. They've agreed to take you directly to Helena with an armed escort. Relief crossed Harold's face. That's the best news I've heard all day. There's a condition, the sheriff continued. The railroad wants Miss Baker to accompany you, Forster. What? Harold's relief transformed instantly to outrage. Absolutely not. Ellie, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. Why me? Sheriff Wilson removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. The telegraph was quite specific. The railroad's legal counsel believes having a character witness someone who knew Forster before this business with Harlow will strengthen the testimony. As the person who tended his wounds and can verify his condition upon arrival in Sweet Creek, you're the logical choice. Harold's face had turned an alarming shade of red. My daughter is not getting involved in this mess. I'll go, Ellie said quietly but firmly. All eyes turned to her in surprise. Eleanor, her father began, but she raised a hand to stop him. This isn't just about Yates anymore, Father. It's about justice for a murdered surveyor. It's about standing against men like Harlow who think they can control everything through violence and intimidation. Her voice strengthened as she continued. If my testimony can help, then it's my duty to provide it. Harold stared at his daughter as if seeing a stranger. This is dangerous, Eleanor. These men have already shown they're willing to kill. And they were willing to do it on our property this morning, she countered. Running and hiding won't make us safer. Yates had remained silent during this exchange, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke, addressing Harold directly. I give you my word, sir. I'll protect her with my life. A promise that means precious little if you're both dead, Harold retorted bitterly. Sheriff Wilson interceded. The coach will have 4 armed guards plus myself. The railroad isn't taking chances with this testimony, Harold. It's their best chance of stopping Harlow's interference with the survey work. A heavy silence fell as Harold wrestled with the situation. Finally, he turned to his daughter, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of fear, pride, and resignation. You're like your mother, he said softly, stubborn as a mountain when you believe you're right. He shook his head. If I forbid this, you'll find a way to go anyway, won't you? Ellie's expression softened. I don't want to defy you, Father, but yes, I believe this is the right thing to do. Harold looked to the sky as if seeking divine guidance before addressing Sheriff Wilson. When does this coach arrive? 4 o'clock, the sheriff replied. We'll escort them directly to the stage depot. That gives us 4 hours, Harold noted. I suggest we use them wisely. He turned back to his daughter. Pack only what you need, Eleanor, and your mother's pistol, the small one that fits in a reticule. Ellie nodded, touched by her father's practical concern even in his opposition. Yes, Father. As the men discussed security arrangements for the journey, Ellie slipped away to prepare for her departure. In her bedroom, she moved with quick efficiency, selecting practical clothing for travel and a single good dress for Helena. Into a small carpetbag went essential toiletries, a daguerreotype of her parents, and a worn copy of Tennyson's poems, the same volume from which Yates had read to her during their courtship. The revolver her father mentioned, a small, silver-plated Derringer, her mother had carried on stage-coach journeys, went into her reticule along with extra cartridges. Ellie handled the weapon with familiar competence. Growing up on a frontier homestead had ensured all the Baker women knew how to shoot. A soft knock at her door interrupted her packing. "Come in," she called, expecting her father. Instead, Yates entered, moving carefully with his walking stick. He remained near the doorway, respecting the propriety of her private space. "Your father sent me up," he explained, anticipating her question. "Said he needed a moment alone to speak with the sheriff." Ellie nodded, continuing her preparations. "We'll be ready to leave when the coach arrives." "Ellie." Something in his tone made her pause and look up. "You don't have to do this. I can tell the railroad you couldn't come." She studied him thoughtfully. "Is that what you want?" "What I want," he said carefully, "is for you to be safe. Like when you left 3 years ago." The words held no accusation, merely an observation. Yates leaned against the doorframe, easing the weight off his injured leg. "I thought I was protecting you then. I'm not sure I was right." "You weren't," Ellie confirmed, folding a shawl into her bag. "And you're not right now either." "This is my choice, Yates. Not yours, not my father's, not the railroad's. Mine." A smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen since his return. "You've changed, Ellie Baker. We both have." She closed the carpetbag, securing the latches before turning to face him fully. "Last night you asked me to consider going with you after Helena." His expression grew serious. "I did. My answer is yes." For a moment, Yates looked as though he hadn't heard her correctly. "Yes," Ellie nodded, her decision crystallizing into certainty as she spoke it aloud. "Not because I'm running away, or because I'm still that starry-eyed girl who believed in poetry and promises, but because these past few days have shown me something important." "What's that?" he asked softly. "That despite everything, the time apart, the changes in both of us, the blood on your hands and the danger at our door, when I look at you, I still see my future." She stepped closer to him. "It's not the same future I imagined 3 years ago. It's something different. Something we'll build together, wherever that may be." Yates reached for her then, his free hand gentle as it cradled her cheek. "I don't deserve this second chance." "Probably not," she agreed with a smile, "but you have it anyway." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, his touch reverent. "I promise you, Ellie Baker, I will spend every day making sure you never regret this decision." The kiss that followed was gentle, yet fervent, a sealing of promises spoken and unspoken, a bridge across the years of separation, and the beginning of something new. When they finally parted, Ellie felt a certainty that had eluded her for 3 long years. "We should go downstairs," she said, practical despite the emotions swirling within her. "Father will be looking for us." Yates nodded, reluctantly creating space between them. As they made their way carefully down the stairs, his injuries and her carpetbag necessitating a slow pace, Ellie felt as though she were descending into a new chapter of her life, one filled with both uncertainty and possibility. In the front room, they found Harold Baker standing alone, staring out the window toward the land he had worked for 30 years. He turned at their approach, his weathered face revealing he had come to terms with his daughter's decision, however reluctantly. "The coach will be here soon," he said, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "Sheriff Wilson and his men are preparing the escort." Ellie set down her bag and crossed to her father, embracing him tightly. "Thank you for understanding, Father." Harold returned the embrace, holding her as though memorizing the feeling. "I don't understand," he admitted quietly. But I recognize that stubborn look in your eye, same one your mother had when she decided to marry a poor rancher against her family's wishes." He released her, turning his attention to Yates. "You bring her back safe, Forster. Whatever happens in Helena, whatever testimony you give, my daughter returns unharmed." "Yes, sir," Yates agreed solemnly. "You have my word." Harold studied the younger man, measuring him against some internal standard. "3 years ago, I told you that you weren't worthy of my daughter, that you had nothing to offer her but empty promises." "I remember," Yates acknowledged, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I still believe that," Harold continued bluntly, "but I also believe a man can change, can become worthy of the things he desires most." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My Eleanor sees something in you worth believing in. Prove her right, and we may yet find peace between us." It was as close to a blessing as Harold Baker could offer, not acceptance, but the possibility of it, contingent on Yates proving himself worthy of the trust Ellie had placed in him. "I will, sir," Yates promised. "Whatever it takes." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Sheriff Wilson appeared at the door. "Coach is coming," he announced. "Time to go." The next few minutes passed in a flurry of activity. Baggage was secured, final instructions exchanged, and goodbyes spoken. Ellie embraced her father one last time, fighting back tears as she promised to write as soon as they reached Helena. The coach itself was an impressive sight, a well-sprung Concorde with the Northern Pacific Railroad's emblem emblazoned on its polished doors. 4 armed guards rode alongside, with Sheriff Wilson taking position at the lead. Inside, the leather seats and brass fittings spoke of the railroad's prosperity and influence. As Yates helped Ellie into the coach, his hand steady despite his injuries, she caught a final glimpse of her father standing on the porch of the only home she had ever known. Harold Baker stood straight-backed and proud, one hand raised in farewell, his expression a complex mixture of fear, resignation, and love. Then the coach lurched forward, and Sweet Creek began to recede behind them, not just physically, but metaphorically, as Ellie Baker embarked on a journey that would carry her far beyond the boundaries of her previous life. Beside her, Yates reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers in a silent promise. Whatever lay ahead, the testimony in Helena, the confrontation with Harlow's influence, the uncertain future beyond, they would face it together. The road to Helena stretched before them, dusty and rutted but leading inexorably forward. As the coach gathered speed, Ellie felt not fear but a growing sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place after years of misalignment. The man beside her had ridden home with blood on his hands, seeking sanctuary and finding something far more precious: forgiveness, understanding, and a second chance at the future they had once dreamed of building together. In the soft golden light of the late afternoon, Ellie Baker smiled and turned her face toward the horizon. 5 years later, the setting sun painted the front porch of the Forster homestead in hues of amber and gold. Ellie sat in a handcrafted rocking chair, a small bundle cradled in her arms, while she watched her 3-year-old son, Harold, chase butterflies in the front garden. "Don't go too far, Harry," she called gently. "Supper will be ready soon." The boy looked up with his father's green eyes and grinned. "Just one more butterfly, Mama," Ellie smiled, adjusting the blanket around her infant daughter's sleeping form. Little Margaret, named for Ellie's mother, was barely 2 months old, with a dusting of dark hair and her father's determined chin. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the path that wound through the pine trees surrounding their property. Her heart quickened with familiar anticipation as Yates appeared, returning from his day's work as the regional security supervisor for the Northern Pacific Railroad. 5 years had changed him. The hardness that had marked his features upon his return to Sweet Creek had softened, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. New lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and responsibility, while the occasional gray strand in his dark hair hinted at the passage of time. "Papa!" Harry abandoned his butterfly pursuit and raced toward his father, who dismounted quickly to sweep the boy into his arms. "There's my little cowboy," Yates said, lifting Harry high before settling him on his shoulders. "Have you been helping your mama today?" "I picked beans and scared away the birds," Harry announced proudly. "Best garden helper in all of Oregon," Yates confirmed, carrying his son toward the porch. Ellie watched them approach, her heart full. After the dramatic events in Helena, where Yates's testimony, supported by her own account of his character and condition upon arriving in Sweet Creek, had led to formal charges against Victor Harlow for the murder of the original surveyor, they had indeed headed west, eventually settling in the lush Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory. The railroad, grateful for Yates's role in removing obstacles to their northern route, had offered him a permanent position overseeing security for their western operations. The work allowed them to purchase this small homestead, build a comfortable house, and start the family they had once only dreamed of. "How are my girls?" Yates asked softly, climbing the porch steps to lean down and kiss Ellie before peering at their sleeping daughter. "Tired but content," Ellie replied with a smile. "Your daughter has your appetite and your stubbornness." Yates chuckled, setting Harry down with instructions to wash up for supper. As the boy scampered inside, Yates settled into the matching rocker beside Ellie, reaching over to gently stroke Margaret's cheek. "Letter came today," Ellie told him. "From Father." Interest sparked in Yates's eyes. "What news from Montana? Sweet Creek is growing." "The railroad's western spur has brought new settlers. Father says they're talking about incorporating as a proper town." She smiled. "He's been nominated for mayor." "Harold Baker, mayor," Yates mused. "The man who once threatened to shoot me if I came within a mile of his daughter, now a respectable politician." "People change," Ellie reminded him, echoing words spoken years ago. Yates nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "He mentions the visit." "Yes." "He's looking forward to meeting Margaret." Ellie shifted the baby gently in her arms. "Says the guest room is already prepared for next month." Their planned journey back to Sweet Creek marked a significant milestone, the first time they would return as a family to the place where their story had nearly ended before it could truly begin. Harold Baker had visited them twice in Oregon, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine affection for his grandchildren and a grudging respect for the man Yates had become. 5 years, Yates said softly, his hand finding hers. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it." "Having second thoughts about our quiet life," Ellie teased, "missing the excitement of outrunning Harlow's men." He laughed, the sound warm in the evening air. "Not for a moment, though I do miss watching you stand up to your father with that fire in your eyes." "I imagine you'll see plenty of that when he starts telling Harry inappropriate stories about his buffalo hunting days," she countered with a smile. They fell into comfortable silence, rocking gently as the light faded and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside came the sounds of Harry talking to himself as he washed up elaborate stories involving cowboys and magical horses that brought smiles to both parents' faces. "I've been thinking," Yates said after a while, his voice contemplative. "A dangerous pastime," Ellie quipped. He squeezed her hand in mock admonishment. "I'm being serious, Mrs. Forster." "Proceed, Mr. Forster." "I've been thinking about forgiveness," he continued. "About how it changes things not just for the forgiven, but for the one who forgives." Ellie studied his profile in the fading light. "What brought this to mind? Harlow died," Yates said simply. "Word came through the railroad office today. Stroke, apparently, though some say he never recovered from losing his empire after the trial." The news landed with surprising weight. Victor Harlow, the man whose actions had nearly cost them everything, had shaped the course of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. "How do you feel about it?" Ellie asked gently. Yates considered the question. "I thought I might feel satisfaction, vindication maybe. But mostly I feel peace, like the closing of a chapter that's been lingering unfinished." Ellie nodded, understanding completely. "The blood has finally washed away." "Yes." His eyes met hers, filled with the depth of feeling that had only grown stronger through the years of partnership, parenthood, and shared struggles. "When I rode back to Sweet Creek that day, I thought my life was ending. I never imagined it was just beginning." "Forgiveness has that power," Ellie said softly. "It fell on you like gentle rain, washing away the blood and revealing the man beneath the man I always knew was there." Yates leaned over to kiss her, a gesture filled with tenderness and gratitude. "I love you, Ellie Forster. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, the words as true now as when first spoken on their wedding day 4 years prior. Inside, Harry called out that he was ready for supper, his childish voice breaking the moment. Margaret stirred in Ellie's arms, tiny fists stretching as she woke. "Duty calls," Yates said with a smile, rising to his feet and extending his hand to help Ellie up. As they moved inside to the warmth and light of their home, Ellie felt the familiar swell of gratitude for the life they had built together. From blood-stained beginnings had grown this beautiful, imperfect, precious existence, a testament to forgiveness, courage, and the enduring power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something luminous and true. Behind them, the last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars of evening emerged to witness the continuing story of the Forster family, a story of second chances, hard-won happiness, and a love that had survived separation, danger, and the passage of years to flourish in the fertile soil of forgiveness.